The moment didn't feel dramatic at first. There was no shouting, no sudden movement, no warning music playing in my head. It began with a sentence delivered calmly, almost casually, as if it were a comment about the weather.
I don't love you anymore. The wedding is off.
Brandon didn't whisper. He didn't hesitate. He said it clearly, loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear. The Italian restaurant was busy, full of the familiar noise of a Saturday afternoon. Clinking glasses, overlapping conversations, the scrape of chairs against tile. And then, almost instantly, that noise dropped away. I noticed because everything felt still. My fork was frozen halfway to my mouth, hovering over a plate of food I no longer recognized. I remember thinking, absurdly, that the sauce was cooling. That detail lodged itself in my brain while everything else struggled to catch up. This wasn't a private conversation. Brandon had chosen this place deliberately. He'd asked for the table by the window. He'd insisted his friends join us for lunch, calling it casual, nothing special. They were close enough now to hear every word, close enough to watch my reaction. That was when it hit me. This wasn't just a breakup. It was a performance.
My name is Megan.
I was 27 years old, engaged for 2 years, and completely unprepared for the realization that the man sitting across from me had planned this moment. What shocked me wasn't what he said, it was how satisfied he looked after saying it. Something inside me didn't shatter. It didn't explode or collapse.
It locked into place. I set my fork down slowly.
My hands were steady, which surprised me. "Thank you for telling me," I said.
Brandon blinked.
Just once. That wasn't the reaction he'd rehearsed for. His mouth curved into a faint smile, but there was confusion underneath it, like an actor who'd missed a cue. I reached for my left hand and slid the engagement ring off my finger. The ring he'd proposed with in front of an audience 2 years earlier.
Another public moment.
Another carefully chosen setting. I slipped it into my coat pocket instead of placing it on the table. "I think this calls for a celebration," I added calmly.
A narrow escape party.
A couple of his friends laughed uncertainly. Brandon smiled wider, clearly enjoying what he thought was denial. He expected tears, pleading, embarrassment. He expected me to shrink. Instead, I took a slow sip of water. "Megan," he said, irritation creeping into his voice. "Did you hear what I said?" "I heard you perfectly," I replied.
You don't love me.
"The wedding is cancelled." "I appreciate the honesty."
The smile vanished.
I pulled cash from my wallet, enough to cover my meal and more, and stood. As I gathered my bag, I looked around at the faces watching me like this was entertainment. "You really planned this," I said evenly. "Public place. Witnesses. Very intentional." His jaw tightened. This wasn't going according to plan. I nodded once toward his friends. "Thanks for being here." This was informative. When I walked out, every eye followed me. But what I felt wasn't humiliation. It was clarity. What I didn't realize yet was that this moment wasn't spontaneous at all. It had been carefully engineered long before I ever sat down at that table. The drive home should have been chaotic. That's what breakups are supposed to feel like. Shaking hands, blurry vision, thoughts spiraling faster than you can catch them. But none of that happened. Instead, memories began rearranging themselves. Scenes I had replayed 100 times before suddenly looked different, as if someone had adjusted the lighting. I wasn't reliving the relationship.
He was reinterpreting it.
I met Brandon when I was 23, fresh out of college and working my first real job as an assistant event coordinator. He was confident, charming, and focused in a way that made you feel chosen when he paid attention to you. On our first date, he listened closely as I talked about my dream of one day starting my own event planning business. He asked questions. He remembered details. I thought that meant he cared. Now I realize he was gathering information. Within the first year, my life began to subtly reorganize itself around his preferences. He didn't like my college friends, so I saw them less. My apartment was inconvenient for his commute, so I moved closer to his office. My business idea was too risky, so I put it on hold. I told myself this was compromise. Relationships required flexibility, right? You adjust. You accommodate.
You meet in the middle.
Except we never actually met in the middle. I adjusted. He stayed exactly the same. Whenever friends questioned his behavior, I defended him automatically. He's under a lot of pressure. He didn't mean it like that. You don't really know him. Even my mother asked me once, gently, whether I was truly happy. I smiled and said yes. But happiness wasn't the right word. Comfortable fit better. Established. Afraid to admit that 4 years of effort might have been built on something unbalanced. The proposal should have been my warning sign. Brandon proposed at his parents' anniversary party, surrounded by extended family and friends, with phones recording from every angle. I said yes because everyone was watching. Because saying no would have caused confusion, disappointment, questions. Looking back, I see the pattern clearly.
Brandon loved an audience.
Wedding planning became a slow lesson in erasure.
He wanted something small and personal.
He wanted something grand and impressive. Every disagreement ended the same way, with me feeling unreasonable for wanting something different. This isn't just about you, he'd say. This is about our future. What he really meant was his image. He earned more than I did, and he never let me forget it. He paid for dinners and trips, framing control as generosity. When I tried to contribute or suggest alternatives, he dismissed it as unnecessary.
And slowly, he shrank.
I stopped trusting my instincts. I asked for approval instead of stating preferences. I apologized for things that didn't require apologies.
He confused peace with silence.
Sitting alone in my car that afternoon, the truth landed with uncomfortable clarity. The woman I had become wasn't weak. She had been trained. My phone buzzed with a text from my best friend, Natalie. How was lunch? I stared at the screen, then typed.
Wedding is off.
I'll explain later. I'm okay. For the first time the words felt honest. Because something inside me knew this wasn't just an ending. It was a release. And soon, I would discover that the breakup itself was only the surface of something far more calculated. That night, Natalie showed up at my apartment without waiting for an invitation. She walked in carrying 2 bottles of wine and a look that said she was prepared to stay as long as it took. Tell me everything, she said, settling onto the couch.
Start from the beginning. Don't leave anything out.
So I didn't. I told her about the restaurant, the way Brandon had announced the end of our engagement like he was delivering a prepared statement. I told her how his friends had been seated nearby, close enough to hear, close enough to watch. I told her about the table he'd specifically requested and the calm satisfaction on his face as he waited for me to react. As I spoke, Natalie's expression changed, not to shock, but recognition. I knew something was off, she said quietly. I just didn't realize how deliberate it was. She admitted she'd noticed how much I'd changed over the years. How I used to argue passionately about ideas and plans, and how I'd slowly started asking permission for things that used to come naturally. She said she'd wanted to say something many times but held back because she knew I would have defended him. And if I'd pushed too hard, she added, he would have used it to isolate you more. Her words settled heavily, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. Brandon. That wasn't the reaction I expected. We should talk. I stared at the screen. 4 years ago, I would have responded immediately, explaining myself, softening his discomfort, trying to restore balance. This time, I did nothing.
The silence felt strange at first, almost irresponsible.
But then something unexpected happened. It felt powerful. The messages kept coming over the next few days. Confusion shifted into irritation.
Irritation hardened into entitlement.
People are asking questions. You need to help me explain this properly. Ignoring me isn't mature. Every message confirmed something important. He wasn't concerned about my well-being. He was concerned about control. About how the story would be told without his guidance. While he texted, I began sorting through the practical pieces of our shared life. Vendor contracts. Deposits.
Spreadsheets.
Everything was under my name. Something he'd once insisted was simpler. Now it felt telling. When I called the wedding venue to cancel, the coordinator offered a credit instead of a refund. An idea took shape.
A narrow escape party.
Not revenge. Not mockery.
A reframing.
Then I stumbled onto something I was never meant to see. A shared document labeled, Priority Notifications. Dozens of names. Notes beside each one. Send immediately after breakup. The file history showed it had been created 2 weeks before that Saturday lunch. My stomach tightened. There were draft messages too. Polished, thoughtful, carefully framed. Brandon sounded decisive and principled.
I sounded incompatible.
Misaligned. Difficult. And then I found the messages to his friends.
Today is the day.
Make sure you're there.
Record everything.
This wasn't a breakup. It was a production. And finally, buried in another thread, a name I didn't recognize. Rebecca. A woman he'd been promising a future to, while still engaged to me. In that moment, the silence I'd chosen made perfect sense. Responding would have fed the narrative. Silence didn't weaken me. It shifted the power completely. And once I understood what he had truly planned, I knew exactly how I would take my story back. Once I saw the document, I couldn't stop looking. Not in a frantic way, not with shaking hands or racing thoughts, but with a growing sense of clarity. The kind that settles in slowly, rearranging everything you thought you understood. The breakup hadn't been emotional. It had been logistical. I opened more shared folders.
Calendar. Message threads.
Notes that once seemed mundane now felt like clues I'd overlooked on purpose. The deeper I went, the clearer the pattern became. Brandon hadn't been deciding whether to leave me. He'd been planning how. I found timelines that no longer made sense until I reread them with new eyes. Meetings he'd scheduled right after the lunch. Messages drafted days in advance. Lists of people he wanted informed immediately, before I could say anything myself. This wasn't about honesty. It was about control. And the more I uncovered, the more I realized how carefully he'd tried to shape the aftermath. He wasn't just ending a relationship. He was managing perception. Preparing his defense before any accusation existed. Making sure his version reached the right people first. What unsettled me most wasn't the organization. It was the intention behind it. Then I noticed something else.
The phone records.
We'd shared a family plan, mostly out of convenience. I'd never thought twice about it. Now, scrolling through the call history, I saw a name I didn't recognize appearing repeatedly over the past several months. Rebecca. The calls started small.
Short check-ins.
A few minutes here and there. Then they grew longer.
More frequent.
Late nights.
Early mornings. A steady escalation that mirrored the slow unraveling of my engagement.
This wasn't a sudden connection. It was an overlap. Brandon hadn't left me before starting something new. He'd built the new thing quietly, patiently, while still planning a public exit from the old one.
And suddenly, the restaurant made sense.
If he ended things privately, there would be questions. Inconsistencies.
Space for doubt.
But a public breakup created witnesses. Evidence. A moment people could reference later. I was there. I saw how she reacted. That's what he wanted. Proof.
He sat back from the laptop, feeling something unexpected rise to the surface. Not a heartbreak.
Disgust. Because the man I'd loved hadn't just been dishonest. He'd been strategic in a way that required me to fail publicly. He needed me to break down so his story would hold. That was why my reaction unsettled him so deeply. I hadn't cried. I hadn't begged. I hadn't raised my voice. I'd thanked him and walked away. By refusing to perform, I'd dismantled months of preparation. The realization landed heavily but cleanly. This wasn't my shame to carry. It never had been. I began organizing what I'd found, not with the intention of exposing him publicly, but with a need to anchor myself in reality.
Screenshots.
Dates. Timelines. Facts. Because I knew what came next. He would try to rewrite it. And this time, I wouldn't doubt my own memory. What I didn't realize yet was that Brandon wasn't just panicking. He was scrambling to regain control before the truth caught up with him. Once the shock wore off, I had a choice to make. I could confront Brandon immediately. Send screenshots, demand explanations, expose every detail I'd uncovered. The urge was there, sharp and tempting. After all, I finally had proof. Not feelings.
Not suspicions.
Facts. But instinct stopped me. For 4 years, I'd reacted to Brandon. Adjusted to him. Explained myself to him. Even now, confrontation would still place him at the center of the story. I didn't want that anymore. So instead of responding, I observed. And Brandon filled the silence quickly. His messages shifted tone again. Less confusion now, more pressure. He framed my lack of response as immaturity, then as cruelty. He warned me people were asking questions, implying I was responsible for fixing the narrative he'd already drafted. What stood out wasn't what he said. It was what he avoided. He never apologized. He never acknowledged the planning. He never mentioned Rebecca. Because apologizing would mean surrendering control. While he texted, I focused on practical steps. I called vendors, canceled contracts, redirected deposits. One by one, the wedding plans unraveled. Not with chaos, but with efficiency. Several people I spoke to sounded relieved rather than surprised. One florist hesitated before saying, "I'm sorry this happened, but honestly, I wondered how long you'd last together." That comment stayed with me. Apparently, I hadn't been hiding my unhappiness as well as I thought. When the venue coordinator confirmed I could use my deposit for a future event, something clicked. The idea that had started as a joke in the restaurant finally took shape.
A narrow escape party. Not to umiliate Brandon.
Not to provoke him, but to reclaim the meaning of what had happened before he could weaponize it. If Brandon wanted to frame this as my failure, I would frame it as my freedom. The party wouldn't mention him. It wouldn't explain the breakup. It would simply celebrate a new chapter. Anyone curious could ask. Anyone invested in the truth would notice the difference between his story and my reality. And if he panicked? That wasn't my responsibility. As plans formed, word began circulating quietly. Friends I hadn't spoken to in months reached out. Family members checked in with a gentleness that felt like relief. Even co-workers sensed something had shifted. Meanwhile, Brandon's messages became shorter, sharper. "This isn't how adults handle things. You're making this worse. We need to talk before this gets out of hand." He was losing patience. And that told me everything. Because people who control narratives panic when they realize they no longer can. I didn't block him. I didn't engage. I simply continued moving forward, one deliberate step at a time. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. And as Brandon grew more desperate to reclaim the story, I was quietly preparing to let the truth speak for itself. I didn't announce the party publicly at first. I didn't need to. Word moved the way it always does. Quietly, sideways, through conversations that weren't meant to reach you. A friend mentioned it to another friend. A cousin told an aunt. A coworker asked a careful question and received an honest but minimal answer. "I'm celebrating a new beginning," I said whenever someone asked. That was enough to spark curiosity. Brandon, on the other hand, couldn't tolerate ambiguity. I learned through mutual connections that he'd started calling people preemptively. Explaining. Justifying. Warning them not to misinterpret what they might hear. He framed the party as evidence of instability. Who celebrates 3 weeks after being publicly dumped? The irony was almost painful. The more he talked, the more people noticed the contrast. His explanations were frantic, defensive, full of urgency. Mine were calm, simple, consistent. I didn't realize how visible that difference was until Natalie called me one evening, her voice sharp with disbelief. "People are starting to compare notes," she said. "And it's not going the way Brandon expected." Apparently, some of the very people who'd been at the restaurant had started questioning what they'd witnessed. They remembered his confidence, yes, but they also remembered how unsettled he looked when I didn't cry. They remembered how quickly he tried to control the aftermath. One detail kept resurfacing. Tyler had been recording. At the time, I'd barely registered it. Now, it felt significant. Brandon hadn't just wanted witnesses. He'd wanted proof.
A permanent record of me unraveling.
Something he could point to if anyone doubted his story. But the footage didn't contain what he needed. No tears. No outburst.
No instability. Just a woman calmly standing up and leaving.
That mismatch was beginning to bother people. The first crack came from an unexpected place.
Brandon's sister, Addison, called me 2 days before the party.
We weren't close, but her voice was careful, sincere. "I've been hearing things," she said. "And I just wanted to check on you." We talked for nearly an hour. She admitted she'd never believed the way Brandon described me. Emotional, unpredictable, difficult. She said I'd always seemed accommodating, almost to a fault. I thought maybe you were just trying too hard, she said quietly.
So had I.
After we hung up, I sat in silence for a long time. Addison's call wasn't about sides. It was about something much simpler. The story Brandon had built wasn't holding. Not because I fought it, but because it didn't match reality. As the party approached, I felt surprisingly calm.
Not vindictive.
Not anxious. Just resolved. I wasn't walking into a confrontation. I was hosting a room full of people who would see me as I was, not as I'd been described.
Brandon sent one final message the night before.
Whatever you think you're doing, you should reconsider. I didn't reply. Because the truth was already in motion. And once the truth starts moving, it doesn't need permission. What I didn't know yet was that the night of the party would force every hidden intention into the open. By the time the night of the party arrived, I felt something I hadn't expected at all.
Calm. Not the numb kind.
Not the forced kind. The steady calm that comes from knowing you are no longer hiding, no longer bracing for impact. I arrived at the venue early, walking through the space slowly, letting it settle into me. It didn't look like the wedding reception we'd once planned.
The room felt warmer now.
Softer. More alive. The decorations reflected my taste. Bold colors, mismatched textures, flowers that felt organic instead of staged. It felt like a room that belonged to a person, not a performance. Guests started arriving just after 7. Friends I hadn't seen in years hugged me tightly. Family members smiled with a relief they didn't bother hiding. Co-workers introduced themselves to one another, surprised by how easy conversation felt. Laughter came quickly, naturally. And slowly the questions surfaced. So, what really happened? I didn't launch into explanations. I didn't rehearse a speech. When someone asked, I answered honestly and simply. I described the restaurant, the announcement, the witnesses, the planning. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't soften it either. People listened. More importantly, they compared. By 8:30, I could feel a subtle shift moving through the room. Conversations became quieter, more focused. People leaned closer. Phones came out, not to post, but to confirm details. Someone would hear one version, then walk across the room to hear another. The story was assembling itself without my effort. What struck me most was the reaction of those who'd been present at the restaurant. One woman, Kevin's wife, approached me with visible discomfort. She apologized for laughing that day, explaining she believed Brandon when he said he was escaping a volatile situation. But you weren't volatile, she said softly. You were composed. I keep thinking about that. She wasn't the only one. By 9 o'clock, Brandon's version of events was visibly unraveling. The calm woman hosting a thoughtful, joyful gathering did not align with the unstable caricature he described. The gap between story and reality was impossible to ignore. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. The truth didn't arrive loudly. It arrived patiently, filling the room piece by piece until there was no space left for the lie to stand comfortably. That's when the energy shifted again. I noticed people glancing toward the entrance. Conversations paused. Attention rippled through the room. Not fear, but anticipation. I turned. And there he was. Brandon stood just inside the doorway, scanning the room with an expression I hadn't seen before. Not confidence. Not control. Panic. He hadn't been invited. He hadn't been prepared. And suddenly, he wasn't the one directing the scene anymore. What happened next would force Brandon to confront the very truth he'd worked so hard to control. I saw Brandon before he saw me. He stood just inside the doorway, shoulders tense, eyes scanning the room as if he were searching for something familiar, and not finding it. The space didn't respond to him the way he was used to. There was no pause of admiration, no subtle shift toward him. Conversations didn't stop. Laughter didn't fade. The room wasn't waiting for him. When he finally noticed me, his expression tightened. He walked toward me quickly, purposefully, like someone trying to reclaim authority through momentum alone. "Megan," he said, low and sharp. "What do you think you're doing?" I met his gaze without flinching.
I'm hosting a party.
"You're spreading lies about me," he said, voice rising just enough to draw attention. "You're trying to humiliate me." That got people's attention. Nearby conversations slowed. A few heads turned. Phones were discreetly lowered, not raised. This wasn't curiosity. It was concern. "I'm not spreading anything," I said calmly. "I've answered questions when people asked. With facts."
The same ones you left behind.
His face flushed. "You went through my files?" "Our files," I corrected. "The ones we shared. The ones you never thought I'd look at." That was when the panic broke through. "This is exactly what I told people about you," he snapped.
Jure unstable. Jure vindictive.
"You're doing this to hurt me." I took a breath, slow and deliberate, and gestured around the room. "Look around, Brandon," I said.
Do uno look unstable to you?
"Does this look like revenge?" The silence that followed was heavy. People weren't watching me anymore. They were watching him. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Whatever argument he'd prepared didn't fit the moment. This wasn't the restaurant. He didn't have an audience primed to see me fall apart. Instead, he had witnesses who had already seen me thrive. "You planned the breakup," I continued, keeping my voice even. "You invited people to watch. You had it recorded. You drafted messages before it happened. You were involved with someone else while we were still engaged. All of that is documented." He shook his head.
You don't understand.
"I understand perfectly," I said. "You needed me to break down so your story would work. When I didn't, you lost control." Someone behind him shifted.
Another person stepped closer, listening openly now. Brandon could feel it, the moment slipping away.
"This isn't over," he muttered. "It is for me," I replied. For a long second, he stood there, surrounded by people who no longer believed him, facing a reality he couldn't spin. Then he turned and walked out, shoulders stiff, jaw clenched.
The room exhaled. Music resumed. Conversations restarted, softer at first, then normal.
Someone touched my arm gently and asked if I was okay. I was. Not because I'd won, but because I'd told the truth without losing myself. What happened after Brandon left would ripple through far more lives than just ours. After Brandon left, the room didn't erupt into celebration. Instead, something quieter happened. People started talking, really talking. Not gossiping, not whispering behind hands, but processing out loud. Conversations formed in small clusters, then shifted and merged as more pieces clicked into place. I didn't lead those conversations. I didn't need to. The truth was already circulating. Several people who had been at the restaurant that day sought me out one by one. Their expressions carried the same mix of discomfort and realization. "I didn't understand it then," one woman admitted. "But watching you tonight, it doesn't match what we were told." Another said, "He made it sound like you were unpredictable. But you were the calmest person in the room." Each comment reinforced the same thing. Brandon's story only worked in isolation. Once people compared notes, it collapsed. Natalie stayed close, not hovering, just present. At one point she leaned in and whispered, "You didn't have to say much. People see it now." She was right.
The power of the evening wasn't the confrontation.
It was contrast. The woman Brandon had described, volatile, desperate, unstable, didn't exist in this room. What existed was someone grounded, composed, hosting a space filled with warmth and connection. The discrepancy was impossible to ignore. By the time the night began winding down, the mood had shifted again. The tension that had briefly surfaced with Brandon's arrival was gone. In its place was something like relief. As if everyone had witnessed a truth that had been waiting for daylight. As guests began leaving, they hugged me longer than usual. Some apologized quietly for believing what they'd been told. Others simply said they were proud of me, though I wasn't entirely sure what for yet. When the room finally emptied, I stood alone for a moment, looking around at the remnants of the night. Half-empty glasses. Discarded napkins. Flowers slightly wilted from warmth and laughter. This was what reclaiming looked like. Not revenge.
Not humiliation.
Presence. Over the next few days, I heard bits and pieces of what followed. Brandon's friends stopped returning his calls. People he'd counted on grew distant. Questions he couldn't answer cleanly began surfacing in places he couldn't control. And then there was Rebecca. She ended things with him shortly after learning the full story. Not just about me, but about the planning, the recording, the manipulation. Apparently, she hadn't known everything. Once she did, she walked away. I didn't feel satisfaction when I heard that. I felt confirmation. Because patterns don't stop with one person. They repeat until they're exposed. As for me, something settled that week. A quiet certainty I hadn't known before. I didn't feel the urge to defend myself anymore. I didn't feel the need to check whether people believed me.
I knew the truth.
And for the first time that was enough. What I didn't realize yet was that the real transformation wasn't happening around me. It was happening inside me. In the weeks after the party, people kept asking me the same question.
How do you feel now?
At first, I didn't know how to answer. I wasn't euphoric. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even particularly relieved. What I felt was something quieter, something unfamiliar. I felt unburdened. For the first time in years, my thoughts were my own. I didn't wake up anticipating someone else's expectations. I didn't rehearse conversations before having them. I didn't adjust my reactions in advance to keep the peace. The absence of that constant mental noise was startling. I realized how much of my energy had gone into managing Brandon. His moods, his image, his comfort. Even after the breakup, he tried to pull me back into that role by demanding explanations, cooperation, participation in his version of events. Walking away wasn't just leaving a relationship. It was exiting a system. People often imagine strength as confrontation. They picture raised voices, final speeches, dramatic ultimatums. I used to think that too. But I learned something important during that period. Strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it looks like disengagement. Every time I chose not to respond to Brandon's messages, I reclaimed a little more space. Every time I refused to explain myself to people who weren't asking in good faith, I felt steadier. Every time I made a decision without wondering how he'd react, something inside me realigned. I noticed it in small ways. I ordered food without checking if someone else approved. I made plans without apologizing. I spoke honestly without softening my words.
Nothing bad happened. No punishment.
No withdrawal of affection.
No sudden collapse.
Just freedom. That's when it hit me. I hadn't been afraid of being alone. I'd been afraid of existing without permission. Brandon's power over me had never come from love. It came from my belief that harmony required my silence. Once that belief dissolved, so did his influence. Occasionally, someone would bring him up in conversation. They'd mention his job, his move, his attempts to start over somewhere new. They'd watch my face carefully, expecting bitterness or satisfaction. I felt neither. Because my life was no longer defined in opposition to his. I wasn't rebuilding to prove anything. I wasn't thriving out of spite. I was simply moving forward, guided by my own instincts again. And that felt like the real victory.
Not the party. Not the confrontation.
The quiet confidence that came from knowing I didn't need to participate in anyone else's narrative to be whole. I had chosen myself. And that choice changed everything. But walking away also taught me something else. There were warning signs I would never ignore again. Distance has a way of sharpening vision. Once the noise of the breakup faded and my days stopped revolving around damage control, I began to notice patterns I had once worked hard to excuse. They weren't dramatic warning signs. There were no explosive arguments or obvious betrayals in the early years. That's what made them dangerous. The first red flag was subtle. How often my discomfort was reframed as a flaw. If something bothered me, Brandon didn't ask why. He explained why I shouldn't feel that way. He was calm, logical, persuasive. By the end of the conversation, I usually apologized for bringing it up at all. At the time, I thought we were communicating well. In reality, I was being trained to doubt myself. Another sign was how public praise and private criticism worked together. In front of others, he complimented me. My appearance, my reliability, how easy I was. In private, he corrected my tone, my phrasing, my reactions. He claimed he was helping me improve, helping me present myself better. I didn't realize how often help required me to become smaller. Then there was decision-making. Big choices always came with explanations about why his way made more sense. My ideas weren't dismissed outright. They were analyzed until they sounded impractical. Emotional.
Naive.
Eventually, I learned to present my opinions already softened, already compromised. That wasn't partnership. That was erosion. The most important red flag, though, was how often I felt relieved when conflict ended, even if nothing had actually been resolved. I mistook that relief for peace. I didn't recognize it as exhaustion. Healthy relationships don't require constant recovery. I also noticed how isolated I'd become without realizing it. Brandon never told me I couldn't see my friends. He simply made it inconvenient. He questioned their intentions. He implied they didn't understand our relationship. Over time, I chose distance on my own, believing it was loyalty. I see now how effective that was. Manipulation rarely looks like control. More often it looks like reason. What surprises me most isn't that I missed these signs. It's how normal they felt at the time. None of them seemed serious enough to leave over. Each one, alone, was explainable. It was only in accumulation that they became dangerous.
Dette de lesson uno carry forward.
I pay attention now to how people respond when I disagree. To whether my success is celebrated or subtly undermined. To whether boundaries are respected without negotiation. I trust discomfort as information, not something to suppress. And most importantly, I no longer confuse endurance with love. Love doesn't require silence. It doesn't demand shrinking. It doesn't frame your instincts as liabilities. The relationship didn't fail because I wasn't enough. It failed because I was slowly being taught not to be myself. I won't make that mistake again. And once I understood that, I was finally ready to make a promise that would guide everything that came next. One quiet evening, weeks after the last conversation about Brandon had finally faded, I sat alone at my kitchen table with a notebook open in front of me. I wasn't journaling to process pain anymore. That phase had passed. What I felt now was clarity. Sharp enough that I didn't want to lose it. I knew how easy it would be, months or years later, to soften the memory, to rationalize parts of it, to forget how slowly I disappeared. So I wrote myself a promise. Not a goal. Not a list of rules. A promise. I promised myself that I would never again stay in a situation that required me to shrink in order to survive. I promised I would leave the moment my instincts began whispering instead of speaking. I promised I would not confuse comfort with safety, or familiarity with love. That promise became an anchor. It guided how I rebuilt my life in ways that surprised me. I started paying closer attention to how people responded to boundaries. Not just whether they respected them, but whether they tried to negotiate them. I noticed who listened without waiting to correct me. Who asked questions instead of offering explanations. I stopped chasing intensity and started valuing steadiness. That shift changed everything. Work felt different when I stopped measuring my ideas against imagined criticism. Friendships deepened when I stopped over-explaining myself. Even rest felt unfamiliar at first, unproductive, undeserved, until I realized how much of my worth I'd once tied to approval. I began making decisions based on alignment rather than fear. Some of them were small. Others were terrifying. But each one reinforced the same truth. Nothing bad happened when I trusted myself. I also learned something unexpected about forgiveness. Forgiving Brandon didn't mean excusing what he did. It didn't require understanding his motives or granting him peace. Forgiveness, for me, meant releasing the version of myself that still felt responsible for fixing the damage. I didn't owe him closure. I owed myself honesty. Honesty meant admitting that staying would have cost me more than leaving ever did. Honesty meant accepting that love should not feel like self-erasure. Honesty meant recognizing that what I had lost wasn't a future. It was an illusion. Once I saw that clearly, resentment lost its grip. The past stopped demanding my attention. The woman I was becoming didn't need to be defended. She didn't need permission. She didn't need to prove she'd been wronged. She simply needed to continue. That promise I wrote that night still sits in my drawer. I don't read it often. I don't need to. I live it. And with that promise guiding me, I finally understood the true meaning of the moment that once felt like my ending. As life settled into a quieter rhythm, I began noticing changes that felt almost too ordinary to matter. That's how I knew they mattered most. I woke up without tension in my chest. I made decisions without rehearsing conversations in my head. I noticed how rarely I checked my phone for validation or reassurance. These weren't dramatic transformations, but they were profound. They were signs that I was no longer living in anticipation of someone else's reactions. For a long time, I had believed that growth required permission. That ambition needed approval. That certainty had to be negotiated. Without realizing it, I had postponed becoming myself until conditions felt safe. Those conditions never arrived. What arrived instead was clarity.
I started revisiting ideas I'd once abandoned.
Not because they were impractical, but because they threatened stability I thought I needed. I reopened notebooks filled with half-formed plans and early sketches of a business I'd once dreamed about. Reading them now felt like meeting a younger version of myself who had been waiting patiently. She hadn't disappeared. She'd been paused. I began small. Freelance projects at first. Then short-term contracts. Each success rebuilt a piece of confidence that had quietly eroded over the years. The work didn't just feel fulfilling. It felt familiar, like something I'd been away from too long. I noticed the same pattern in my relationships. I stopped overextending to keep connections alive. I stopped explaining my boundaries. I let people show me, through their actions, whether they could meet me where I was. Some couldn't. That was okay. Others surprised me. Friends I'd lost touch with reappeared easily, without resentment or interrogation. Family relationships grew closer when I stopped pretending everything had been fine all along. Honesty, I learned, invited honesty in return. What struck me most was how little effort it took once I stopped forcing myself into spaces that required performance. The peace I felt wasn't fragile. It was sturdy. Occasionally, I thought about Brandon, not with anger, but curiosity. I wondered whether he understood what had really happened. Whether he recognized that the moment he tried to control so tightly had slipped beyond him the instant I refused to play my part. But those thoughts didn't linger. My attention had shifted. I was no longer defining myself in contrast to who I'd been with him. I wasn't rebuilding to prove resilience. I was simply continuing. The woman I was becoming didn't feel like a reaction. She felt like a return. And the more I trusted that feeling, the clearer it became. The life I was building now wasn't a recovery. It was the life I had always intended to live. Once I stopped waiting. And standing in that truth, I realized the moment that once felt like humiliation had quietly become my turning point. For a long time I thought strength looked like endurance. It looked like staying calm when something hurt. Like explaining yourself clearly enough that another person finally understood. Like waiting patiently for circumstances to improve if you were just reasonable enough, loving enough, flexible enough. That belief shaped more than my relationship with Brandon. It shaped how I moved through the world. I absorbed discomfort and called it maturity. I swallowed disappointment and labeled it compromise. I stayed silent and told myself it was peace. Walking away forced me to redefine all of it. Real strength, I learned, doesn't require you to tolerate erasure. It doesn't demand that you minimize yourself to preserve harmony. Strength doesn't live in endurance. It lives in discernment. I started noticing how often I'd confused emotional control with emotional health. I was proud of how rarely I raised my voice, how composed I remained under pressure. But composure had become armor, not balance. I wasn't regulating my emotions. I was suppressing them. That distinction mattered. Once I let myself feel anger without judgment, it passed quickly. Once I acknowledged grief without dramatizing it, it softened. Once I allowed relief to exist alongside sadness, I felt whole instead of conflicted. Strength wasn't the absence of emotion. It was the willingness to honor it honestly. This new definition changed how I responded to challenges. When something felt wrong, I didn't push through automatically. I paused. I asked myself whether persistence was coming from purpose or fear. I stopped proving resilience and started practicing self-respect. That shift affected everything. At work, I stopped volunteering for roles that drained me simply to appear capable. I spoke up when expectations were unclear instead of fixing problems silently. The result wasn't backlash. It was clarity. In relationships, I stopped equating effort with value. I no longer chased connection at the expense of comfort. I noticed who met me with curiosity instead of correction, who listened instead of strategizing their response. Some people drifted away. Others stayed more solidly than before. And that taught me another lesson.
Strength doesn't isolate you.
It filters. The people who remained in my life were those who didn't benefit from my self-doubt. They didn't need me to be quieter, easier, or more accommodating. They welcomed the version of me who spoke clearly and stood still in her decisions. I also stopped romanticizing the past. The relationship with Brandon didn't fail because we misunderstood each other. It failed because understanding was never the goal. Control was. And no amount of patience can transform control into partnership. Accepting that freed me from wondering what I could have done differently. The answer was simple. I could have left sooner, but only if I'd known what strength really was. Now I do. And with that understanding, the final piece of the story fell into place, changing how I viewed that restaurant moment forever. A year later, I walked past the same restaurant. Same windows. Same outdoor tables. Same steady flow of people moving through their weekend without any awareness of what that place meant to me. I stopped for a moment. Not because I felt pulled backward, but because I finally understood what had happened there. That afternoon hadn't been my humiliation. It had been my turning point. At the time, I thought I was simply surviving an unexpected public breakup. I believed I was holding myself together out of necessity, choosing composure because falling apart felt too vulnerable, too exposed. But standing there now, I saw it differently. I hadn't stayed calm because I was numb. I had stayed calm because, on some level, I already knew the truth. The truth was that the relationship had ended long before that lunch. The truth was that the man across from me hadn't been my partner in a long time. He'd been my audience. The truth was that the moment he tried to script my downfall was the moment his influence ended. He thought power came from control. I learned power comes from choice. That day, I chose dignity without fully realizing it. I chose to stand up without begging. I chose not to argue with someone who needed me to break in order to feel justified. I chose to walk away with myself intact. Everything that followed, the discovery, the party, the exposure, the rebuilding, grew from that single choice. I didn't leave that restaurant knowing what my life would look like next. I didn't have a plan or a clear future waiting. What I had was something far more important. I had myself. The woman who left that table wasn't stronger because she endured pain quietly. She was stronger because she refused to perform it. She didn't collapse on command. She didn't confirm a story written without her consent. She stepped out of the frame entirely. Looking back now, I understand that not every ending announces itself as freedom. Some arrive disguised as rejection. Some wear the face of loss. Some unfold in front of strangers, under bright lights, when you least expect them. But endings that reveal truth are not failures. They are exits. I don't regret that moment anymore. I don't wish it had happened differently. I wouldn't soften it or rewrite it, even if I could. Because without that sentence, spoken too loudly in the wrong place, for the wrong reasons, I might still be negotiating my worth in silence. Instead, I found my voice. And once you find your voice, you don't need to be invited back into rooms that only wanted you small. You build your own. Because sometimes the moment meant to break you is the one that finally sets you free.